You're listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about the Emissions Gap Report 2022. Source for the content is Ariba's article for the Indian Express. The Emissions Gap Report 2022, The Closing Window Climate Crisis Calls for Rapid Transformation of Societies, was released by the United Nations Environment Programme, that is UNEP. The report focused on the need for countries to take significant steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions ahead of the United Nations Climate Change Conference 2022, that is UNFCCC COP27, that will begin on the 6th of November in Egypt. Inger Anderson, executive director of UNEP, said that this report tells us in the cold scientific terms what nature has been telling us all year through deadly floods, storms, and raging fires. We have to stop filling our atmosphere with greenhouse gases and stop doing it fast. We had our chance to make incremental changes, but that time is over. Only a root and branch transformation of our economies and societies can save us from accelerating climate disaster. Now, what does the 2022 Emissions Gap Report say? The annual report assesses the gap between the pledges taken by different countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the estimated reduction required to maintain the average global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, at the end of this century. The flagship report is managed by the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. It serves as a scientifically authoritative source of timely and policy relevant information to key decision makers, guiding the UNFCCC process and implementing the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, adopted by 196 countries in 2015 at COP21, was aimed at limiting global warming and maintaining the average global temperature rise ideally to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. According to the 2022 report, the national pledges taken by the countries since last year only make a negligible difference to predicted 2030 emissions. These pledges, or the nationally determined contributions (NDC), only reduce the emissions by 1% by the end of the decade. With the current policies, the global temperature is expected to rise by 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, and emissions should be cut down by 45% globally to maintain the goal temperatures. It emphasized transformative solutions across sectors, including food systems. Now, why focus on the food systems industry? Food systems comprise all food products derived from crop and livestock production, forestry, fisheries, and the larger socio-economic systems surrounding them. While other sectors are dominant in the global climate action plans, food systems are neglected. This often prevents the people from recognizing emissions produced as a result of their consumption and production patterns, as well as of livestock. In a first, New Zealand recently planned to tax agricultural emissions, which includes those from livestock, burps, and waste, in an attempt to transition to a low emissions future and fulfill its promise to price agriculture emissions from 2025, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern stated on the 11th of October 2022. New Zealand is one of the world's largest exporters of dairy and meat products. However, the agricultural production processes result in significant greenhouse gas emissions. Mostly biogenic methane and nitrous oxide are responsible for about half of New Zealand's gross emissions. Hence, a pricing mechanism will be introduced to achieve the emissions reduction target by 2050. So, what are livestock emissions? Emissions from livestock mainly include carbon dioxide from urea, nitrous oxide from livestock dung and urine, and methane from belching, among others. They contribute towards the greenhouse effect as due to these gases, heat gets trapped around the surface of the earth and cause global warming. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is IPCC, the global warming potential (GWP) of gases is a metric that helps measure the radiative effect of each unit of gas over a specific period of time, such as 100 years, as expressed relative to the radiative effect of carbon dioxide. Through GWP, we know gases such as nitrous oxide and methane produce more heat around the Earth's surface than carbon dioxide or CO2, which is taken as a reference. It absorbs more energy than CO2 but stays in the atmosphere for a shorter duration. Over a 10-year period, it has 80 times more GWP than that carbon dioxide, according to the UNEP website. How are these gases produced by the agriculture industry? While nitrous oxide is emitted through livestock dung and urine, and carbon moves in the atmosphere in various forms, looking at the production of methane gives us a better insight into effective ways in which countries can tackle climate change. Manure and gastrointestinal releases account for about 32% of human caused methane emissions. In the livestock sector, popular belief says cow flatulence is a bigger source of methane than cow belching. However, NASA claims that's not entirely true. The process of cow belching releases more methane into the environment due to enteric fermentation, a digestive process where complex sugars are converted into simpler molecules to be absorbed into the bloodstream, producing methane as a byproduct. Whenever a farm animal digests food, methane is released into the atmosphere. Further, the cultivation of paddy, which floods the fields, prevents oxygen from penetrating the soil and creates suitable conditions for methane emitting bacteria. This accounts for roughly 8% of human linked emissions, the official UNEP website highlights. And IPCC research showed that methane is responsible for at least a quarter of today's global warming. An assessment by the UNEP and Climate and Clean Air Coalition in 2021 found that cutting human or farming related methane emissions by 45% of this decade is key in the global battle against climate change. At COP26 last year, China, as one of the biggest emitters of methane, entered a bilateral agreement with the US for reducing methane emissions. Talking about carbon, the US highlighted that it would become 100% carbon free by 2035, and China promised to phase down its coal consumption beginning in 2025. However, environmental activists and civil society called the Glasgow Climate Pact adopted at the end of the conference a weaker than expected agreement. With the latest report, all eyes are on COP27 in Egypt, with a focus on climate adaptation, climate finance, and transition to assist countries that are most affected by climate change. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the IELTS exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com. Thanks for listening and do subscribe to our channel.